The grocery store hummed with the familiar rhythm of everyday life. Shoppers pushed their carts down the aisles, their minds half focused on their lists, half distracted by the background noise of checkout beeps and distant conversations. The scent of fresh bread wafted from the bakery, mingling with the crisp coolness of the produce section. It was the kind of ordinary day that no one would remember until, suddenly, it wasn't. In the middle of the store, near the neatly stacked apples and oranges, Jordan Carter moved with quiet ease. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed casually in a gray hoodie and jeans, he blended effortlessly into the crowd. His presence was unassuming, his demeanor calm. He wasn't in a rush, just picking up a few essentials before heading home. A gallon of milk in his basket, a loaf of whole wheat bread. Simple things. Across from him, Edith Reynolds stood adjusting her reading glasses, squinting at the label of a bag of Honeycrisp apples. In her late 70s, she carried herself with the stern posture of someone who had lived through enough years to believe she had seen it all. Her silver hair was carefully pinned back, her cardigan buttoned up to the top. She muttered under her breath, frustrated at the small print on the packaging, her fingers tightening around the handle of her cart. Jordan reached for a bag of oranges. That was it. Just a simple, thoughtless movement, one he had done hundreds of times before. But in that split second, something changed. Edith's head snapped up. Her eyes locked onto him, her face tightening in a way that wasn't subtle. There was a shift, small but undeniable, like the sudden drop in air pressure before a storm. The store kept moving, unaware. But for those close enough to see it, something was about to happen. The moment stretched, just a breath longer than it should have. Jordan could feel it before he even looked up, the weight of a stare that lingered too long, pressing against the edges of his awareness. When he finally lifted his eyes from his phone, he found himself face to face with something sharp, something cold. Edith Reynolds wasn't just looking at him, she was studying him, sizing him up in a way that made his skin prickle. Her lips were pressed into a thin, disapproving line, her hands gripping her shopping cart as if bracing herself against something. And then she said it. Loud enough for those nearby to hear, sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of the store. "You people don't belong here." The words hung there, sudden, heavy, undeniable. For a split second, everything around them continued as normal. A toddler giggled from somewhere near the bakery. A man on his phone muttered about checking out before traffic got bad. The overhead speakers played a soft instrumental tune. But within their small circle of space, the world had just shifted. Jordan's fingers tensed around the handle of his grocery basket. His mind, trained to dismiss casual rudeness, told him maybe he misheard. Maybe she had been talking about something else. But then she spoke again. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The air changed. A nearby shopper stopped mid-reach for a bag of grapes. A cashier, scanning items at the self-checkout, hesitated for half a second before continuing, her hands suddenly mechanical. A young mother near the dairy aisle instinctively pulled her child closer. Jordan heard it all, the quiet intake of breath from a man near the potatoes, the shuffle of feet from someone pretending not to listen, the way silence stretched just a little too long. He swallowed. It wasn't the first time he had heard words like that, but it had never stopped stinging. Edit. H wasn't finished. Her voice, brittle but unwavering, carried through the space between them, as though she was waiting for someone to agree with her. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." Jordan's heartbeat drummed against his ribs, steady but firm. He glanced at the people around him. Some avoided eye contact, choosing silence over confrontation. Others watched with careful expressions, caught in the uncomfortable limbo between curiosity and disapproval. And then there were the few who, like Edith, didn't seem surprised at all. He had a choice. He could walk away. He could pretend he didn't hear it, could push past and let the moment dissolve into the air like it never happened. Or he could turn and face it. Jordan exhaled slowly, shifting his weight. The store around him had gone eerily still. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed quieter. Edith's face remained hard, unyielding. She was waiting for a reaction. And she was about to get one. The weight of the moment pressed against Jordan's chest, but he didn't let it show. His grip tightened around the handle of his grocery basket, his breathing measured. He wasn't a stranger to moments like this, but that didn't make them any less exhausting. All eyes were on him now. The grocery store, once buzzing with the dull hum of everyday life, had turned into something else entirely. A stage. An audience. A moment teetering on the edge of something bigger than just words. Jordan could feel it. A storm had been thrown at his feet, and everyone was waiting to see if he would step into it. He met Edith's stare, his own expression unreadable. His first instinct was to snap back, to let his frustration spill out like a flash of lightning. But he knew better. Anger would only fuel her fire. Instead, he let a slow breath fill his lungs, his posture shifting just slightly. Not defensive. Not aggressive. Just firm. Grounded. And then, he spoke. "Ma'am," his voice was calm, deliberate, cutting through the thick tension. "Do you even realize what you just said?" His words weren't confrontational. They weren't angry. They were something else, a mirror held up to her own reflection. For a moment, Edith didn't respond. Maybe she hadn't expected him to speak at all. Maybe she had assumed he would just walk away, head down, swallowing the words like so many others had before. But Jordan wasn't walking away. Her lips pressed tighter. She squared her shoulders. She was doubling down. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising slightly, as if daring him to challenge her. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." The silence that followed was suffocating. Someone near the bread aisle let out an audible gasp. The young cashier at the self-checkout froze, her hands hovering over a carton of eggs she had been scanning. A man near the deli counter muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. Jordan remained still. He didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He simply let the words settle. He could see it now, the way her statement was beginning to weigh on those around them. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting where they stood. Others exchanged glances, silently questioning whether they should step in. But no one spoke. They were waiting for him. Jordan exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. Then, he did something Edith wasn't expecting. He nodded. Not in agreement, but in something deeper. Understanding. Recognition. He had seen this before. He had heard this before. And now, he was going to make sure she heard something too. "All right," he said finally, his voice even, unshaken. "Let's talk about that. Since you brought it up." A ripple went through the crowd. The moment was shifting. The storm had come. But it wasn't going to unfold the way anyone expected. A hush settled over the store. The moment had stretched beyond mere confrontation. It had become something else entirely. Something weightier. Something impossible to ignore. Edith H's expression didn't soften. If anything, she looked more rigid, as if bracing for an argument. But Jordan wasn't here to argue. He picked up his grocery basket, shifted his weight slightly, then met her gaze not with anger, not with defiance, but with a kind of quiet strength that made her uneasy. "You said I don't belong here." His voice was steady, firm, carrying across the store with a weight that made the air feel thicker. "That I should go back to Africa." Edith said nothing. Jordan tilted his head slightly, considering his words carefully before he spoke again. "Let me tell you something about where I come from." His voice was calm, deliberate, but with an undercurrent of something deeper, history carried in his very breath. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi." The words landed like stones in a quiet pond, sending ripples through the listening crowd. He was a sharecropper. He worked land he didn't own, broke his back so his children might have a better life. Edith's fingers curled around the handle of her cart. The people around them were listening now, not just watching. Jordan continued. His father was a slave. He didn't rush. He let the words sink in, settle into the silence like a truth too long ignored. Kidnapped. Beaten. Sold like cattle. Forced to build the very country you're standing in. A man near the dairy section shifted uncomfortably. The young cashier at self-checkout had completely abandoned her scanning, staring at Jordan as if she had never heard history spoken like this before. Edith swallowed, but still said nothing. Jordan's voice didn't waver. "My grandfather?" He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "He fought in World War II, risked his life in a war that sent him overseas to fight for freedom." A bitter smile touched his lips, only to come back home and be treated like a second-class citizen. Edith's eyes flickered, just a flicker, but it was enough. A crack in the armor. Jordan wasn't done. He wasn't allowed to sit at the same counters. His voice grew stronger, sharper. Couldn't drink from the same water fountains. Couldn't even vote in the country he fought for. Someone near the bread aisle inhaled sharply. Jordan let the silence stretch just long enough. Then, he took a step forward, not aggressive, just enough to close the space between them. My parents? He shook his head slightly, his tone softer now, but no less powerful. They fought too, not with guns, not with fists, but by raising me to believe in kindness, in respect, in hard work. He let the words settle before continuing. My mother is a teacher. He met Edith's gaze. She's spent her entire life helping kids no matter what they look like. Edith's grip on her cart tightened. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Jordan's voice lowered just enough to make her lean in. My father is a mechanic. He gave a small, knowing nod. The kind of man who'd stop on the side of the road to help you, if your car broke down. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jordan let out a quiet breath. So tell me. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Do I belong here? Or have I and my family already paid the price for this country with our blood, sweat, and tears? Edith's face flushed. She looked around, searching for anyone to back her up. But the crowd had shifted. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with truth. And it had left everyone changed. For a moment, the silence in the grocery store was heavier than any words. Jordan's voice had settled over the crowd like a tide rolling in, slow, deliberate, and undeniable. The weight of his family's history, the undeniable truth of what had been endured, hung in the air like a storm that had passed, but left the sky changed forever. Edith Reynolds stood frozen. The redness in her face hadn't faded, but something in her posture had shifted. She wasn't as rigid now. Her hands trembled slightly as they clutched the bag of apples in her cart. She opened her mouth, as if to speak, but no words came out. And then, someone else stepped forward. A middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap, his name tag still pinned to his jacket from a long shift at the local auto shop, cleared his throat. He's right. His voice was rough, like someone who didn't speak up often but knew, in this moment, he had to. We've got to be better than this. The ripple had started. A woman near the frozen food section nodded, her voice soft but certain. My dad fought in that same war, she said, her eyes glistening slightly. He always told me the only color that mattered was the red on the flag. A murmur spread through the onlookers, small nods of agreement. Quiet acknowledgments. The shifting of weight from foot to foot as people realized they were part of this moment, too. Near the checkout lanes, a young cashier, barely 20, with a ponytail and a name tag that read Melissa, called out, her voice carrying across the store. I've never seen anyone handle something like that with so much grace. She shook her head in awe. Thank you. Edith flinched at that. She wasn't used to being on the other side of a crowd. She glanced around, searching for some kind of support, some validation that she hadn't been wrong. But none came. Instead, a soft clap rang out from somewhere in the back. It was hesitant at first. One pair of hands, clapping slowly. Then another. And another. Until the store was filled with the sound of quiet but undeniable applause. Jordan didn't smile. This wasn't about applause. He exhaled slowly, nodding once, not for himself, but for the moment. For the shift that had happened. Edith's fingers clenched around the handle of her cart. Her pride was a fortress, but cracks had started to form. She glanced at Jordan again, but the fire in her eyes had dimmed. Her voice, when it finally came, was quieter. I didn't mean, she started, but she didn't finish. Because, deep down, she knew she had meant it. And now, for the first time, she was starting to understand what those words had carried. Jordan met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He wasn't looking for an apology. Instead, his voice softened. It's not about what you meant, he said. It's about how it came across. The store had changed. The people had changed. Even Edith Reynolds, though she wouldn't admit it yet, had changed. The ripple had begun. And it wouldn't stop here. Edith Reynolds stood still, gripping the handle of her cart as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. For the first time in a long time, she felt unsure. She had lived through nearly 8 decades of life. She had seen wars, presidents come and go, shifts in culture that she never quite understood. But this moment, this was something different. The crowd around her had changed. They weren't just bystanders anymore. They were witnesses. And worse yet, they weren't standing with her. Her throat felt tight. She wanted to defend herself. wanted to say something, anything that would turn this moment around, give her back control. But what could she say? The words she had spoken were still there, echoing in her own mind, now stripped of the confidence she'd once had. You people don't belong here, go back to Africa. She had said them as if they were simple truths, spoken without hesitation. And yet, here she was watching them unravel, watching them reflect back at her through the eyes of everyone around. Jordan Carter wasn't looking at her with anger. That might have been easier. She had faced anger before. She knew how to fight against it, how to push back. But this quiet, steady dignity? It unsettled her. Jordan wasn't gloating. He wasn't standing over her, reveling in the moment. He had spoken his truth, but now he was simply watching her, waiting to see if she would hear it. The discomfort twisted in her chest. She turned her gaze to the older man in the baseball cap, the one who had spoken first, who had said he's right. He wasn't looking at her with judgment. He just looked tired, as if he had seen too many moments like this, had been waiting too long for people like her to understand. Edith swallowed hard. Her fingers clenched around the bag of apples in her cart, but the weight of them felt different now. She had spent her life believing certain things, never questioning them. She had been raised in a world where people stuck to their own, where the past was the past and history was something distant, something she could ignore. But Jordan had dragged history right in front of her, had spoken it not from a textbook, not from some distant documentary, but from his own bloodline, his own family, and she had no defense against that. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. She could feel the crowd still watching, waiting. She thought about her own family, her grandchildren. Would they have been ashamed of her just now? That thought stung more than she wanted to admit. She wanted to walk away, wanted to push her cart forward and pretend none of this had happened. But she couldn't. Not yet. Her lips parted, but she hesitated. The words felt foreign, difficult. She wasn't ready to apologize, not yet. But she wasn't ready to fight anymore, either. Instead, she did something no one expected. She simply lowered her gaze. Not submission. Not defeat. But a recognition, however small, that something inside her had shifted. She turned her cart slowly, her steps hesitant, the weight of the moment still pressing down on her. For the first time in her life, Edith Reynolds was questioning herself. And that was the beginning of something new. Edith Reynolds gripped her cart and slowly turned away. She didn't apologize. The words never came. But something in her had changed. She wasn't storming off in anger, wasn't throwing out another sharp remark. Instead, she was retreating, not in defeat, but in quiet reflection. Jordan Carter watched her go, his expression unreadable. He didn't expect an apology. People like Edith didn't change overnight. But sometimes, you planted a seed. And that was enough. The tension in the grocery store began to ease, like a held breath finally being released. The baseball cap man gave Jordan a firm nod. The woman near the frozen foods section wiped at her eyes. Even the young cashier at self-checkout, Melissa, seemed to stand a little taller, as if she had witnessed something that mattered. Jordan exhaled. He hadn't come here for a confrontation. He just wanted oranges. But sometimes, life had other plans. He bent down, picked up his grocery basket, and started toward the checkout lanes. As he walked past, a woman reached out, just a light touch on his arm. Jordan turned. She was older, with soft wrinkles and kind eyes. The kind of person who had seen a lot in life, who understood the weight of moments like these. "Thank you for saying what needed to be said," she murmured. Jordan gave her a small nod. "Sometimes," he said, voice low, "it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure people hear the truth." She smiled. A tired, knowing smile. He moved toward the checkout, slipping back into the routine of the day, but the grocery store didn't feel the same anymore. The usual hum of small talk and scanning items had returned, but something unspoken had shifted. People weren't just moving past what had happened. They were thinking about it. Melissa, the young cashier, scanned his items carefully. She hesitated for a split second before speaking. "What you said back there?" She looked up at him, her voice quieter than before. It meant a lot. Jordan gave her a reassuring smile. "Grace," he said simply. "Sometimes, that's the only way to break through." Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Jordan made his way to his car, placing his groceries in the trunk. As he glanced up, he spotted Edith in her own car, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the glass. She didn't glare. She didn't scowl. She just sat there. Jordan didn't move toward her. Some lessons take time to settle. He had already said what needed to be said. He climbed into his car, turned the key, and drove away. Later that evening, Jordan sat across from his father at the kitchen table, recounting the day's events. His father, a man of few words, but deep wisdom, listened intently, hands folded. When Jordan finished, his father let out a slow breath, nodding. "You did the right thing, son," he said finally. "Not just for yourself. For everyone who was watching." Jordan stared down at his hands. "You think she'll change?" His father's eyes softened. "People like her, they don't change fast." He leaned forward slightly. "But you planted a seed. That's all you can do sometimes. Plant the seed and let it grow." Jordan exhaled, letting the words sink in. Because deep down, he knew his father was right. Across town, Edith Reynolds sat at her dining table, staring at her untouched dinner. Jordan's words still echoed in her mind. She thought about her grandchildren, and for the first time in a long time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. Some moments in life are small, passing in an instant. But some stay with you. And sometimes, all it takes to start a change is one conversation. Some moments in life seem ordinary: a trip to the grocery store, a casual conversation, but they can hold the power to shift perspectives, to plant seeds of understanding. This story isn't just about confrontation. It's about the strength found in grace, patience, and truth. Jordan Carter could have responded with anger, and no one would have blamed him. But instead, he chose dignity. He chose to educate rather than to fight, to hold his ground without hostility. And in doing so, he did more than silence prejudice, he forced reflection. Edith Reynolds may not have changed overnight, but she walked away thinking. And that is where change begins. For those watching, it was a reminder. We all have a choice. When faced with ignorance or hate, do we meet it with more anger? Or do we meet it with wisdom, patience, and the courage to speak truth? Words matter. Actions matter. And sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is to stand firm in who we are, without losing our kindness along the way. Because change doesn't always happen in an instant, but it starts somewhere. Life is full of moments that test our character. Sometimes, the most profound change begins with a single conversation, one that challenges, enlightens, and plants a seed for something greater. Kindness, patience, and truth have the power to break barriers. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and subscribe to join us in sharing powerful stories of wisdom, resilience, and transformation.